Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening. As we get started, please join me in an opening prayer. Divine Creator, you sustain the world with love and justice. We gather today in recognition that not all is right. Injustice abounds in your creation, in your planet, in your people. And yet, when we are at our best, democracy can lead us toward right relationships with each other and with the whole world. May we be grounded today in the truth of what's happening to our democracy. May we cast a vision to repair the broken strands of our civic life. And may we go forth from here as healers of our democracy. Amen. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here today. My name is Avery Davis Lamb. I'm a co-executive director of Creation Justice Ministries. At Creation Justice Ministries, we work with Christian communities across the country to protect, restore, and rightly share God's creation. We're delighted to be co-hosting this webinar today with our close friend and partner, Interfaith Power and Light. Interfaith Power and Light, or IPL, inspires and mobilizes people of faith and conscience to take bold and just action on climate change. I bring greetings to you this evening from IPL President Susan Hindershot, who's currently recovering from COVID. So please hold her in your prayers this evening. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge that I'm joining you tonight from the ancestral lands of the Lumbee, Tuscarora, and Occaneechi people here in modern-day Durham, North Carolina. I want to acknowledge the place-based knowledge of these people, and I'm grateful for the historic and ongoing stewardship of the lands where I'm able to live. And I invite you, if you haven't already, to please place in the chat the name of the people on whose land you live and rely upon now. Before we get into the program for this evening, I just want to share a couple housekeeping notes to keep in mind. First of all attendees are muted and you will not be able to unmute throughout the program this evening. However, we welcome your engagement through the chat. You can use the chat to comment, to share, to dialogue together throughout this evening. If you have questions, we ask that you use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you're not familiar with the Q&A features, you'll see a button there at the bottom, and it says Q&A, and you can enter your questions there. I ask that you please enter your questions into the Q&A function instead of into the chat function, because it makes it easier for us to track. Thanks, everyone. So here's why we're gathering tonight. We're gathering because we believe that as voters, we have the ability to choose the elected leaders who represent us. And when it comes to elections, we want a transparent process we can trust, where Americans have equal freedom to vote, regardless of identity, regardless of where we live, regardless of how we worship. But today, a handful of politicians have put up barriers to silence our voices. Interfaith Power and Light's Faithful Voter Reflection Guide states that voting is the very foundation of representative democracy. But this most basic right has been undermined by courts and politicians who make it harder for citizens to participate in the political process. Those who erect obstacles to voting are violating one of our most sacred values and damaging our democracy. So tonight, we'll discuss with our guests what's at stake right now for American democracy and why people of faith and conscience and our faith communities are uniquely positioned to protect democracy. The webinar this evening will run for 1 hour. In this time, we'll hear Reverend Adam Taylor about the importance of democracy and voting in this moment. And then we'll hear from advocates working on the ground in Georgia, Michigan, and Texas. Our time together, we hope, will inspire and equip you to protect democracy and elections in your community. Because together we can ensure that every American can safely and freely cast their ballot so that every voice is heard and our elections reflect the will of the people. Now I'm excited to introduce our first speaker this evening. The Reverend Adam Russell Taylor is president of Sojourners. Taylor previously led the Faith Initiative at the World Bank Group and served as vice president in charge of advocacy at World Vision US and as the senior political director at Sojourners. Taylor has served as the executive director of Global Justice, an organization that educates and mobilizes students around global human rights and economic justice. And in 2009, Reverend Taylor was selected as a White House Fellow and served in the Obama White House Office of Cabinet Affairs and Public Engagement. Reverend Taylor is a graduate of Emory University, the Harvard University Kennedy School of Government, and the Samuel DeWitt Proctor School of Theology. He serves on the Independent Sector Board, the Global Advisory Board of Tear Fund UK, and is a member of the inaugural class of the Aspen Institute Civil Society Fellowship. Reverend Taylor is ordained in the American Baptist Church and the Progressive National Baptist Convention, and he serves in ministry at the Alfred Street Baptist Church in Alexandria, Virginia. Please, everyone, join me in welcoming Reverend Adam Russell Taylor.
Avery, thank you for that kind introduction. It is really a joy and honor to be with you tonight. I'm grateful for the work of Interfaith Power and Light and for Creation Justice Ministries, both real partners of Sojourners. Hope that many of you are familiar with us, with our publications, both digital and magazine, but also our mobilizing work, and certainly would invite you to learn more about our work at sojo.net. I want to start just with a little bit of my own story. I was born in the shadow of the civil rights struggle. My parents made the controversial decision to get married in 1968, the same year that Dr. King was assassinated, and just a year after interracial marriage was legalized in this country. The decision was controversial because my mother's Black and my father's white, and they decided to put their love over so much of the bigotry that they experienced at that time in history. And they instilled in me a deep and abiding belief that each and every one of us is made in the very image of God, and that our diversity, my diversity, but in a larger sense, our nation's racial, religious, ethnic diversity was a true strength and not a weakness. It was an asset and not a liability. And they also instilled in me that my generation, Generation X, inherited the unfinished business of the civil rights struggle. And so I grew up mesmerized by the civil rights movement. It's one of the reasons I chose this backdrop, which is an iconic photo from the civil rights movement. And I quickly understood by kind of studying the speeches of Dr. King and reading books by Taylor Branch and many others, that part of that unfinished business certainly was to combat poverty and to address economic justice issues. Later, I certainly understood that it included addressing our crisis of mass incarceration and racialized policing. But I have to admit that when I was growing up, I never could imagine that continuing to fight for the suffrage, for the right to vote, would be a core part of helping to finish the unfinished work of the civil rights movement. Perhaps I was naive, not realizing that the vote unlocks so much more when it comes to not only maintaining our democracy, but advancing so many of the issues that we care so deeply about because of our faith, including protecting our planet and advancing climate justice, which is certainly a core priority of Sojourners and of all of you. Frederick Douglass once said that there is no progress without struggle. And when we look at the landscape of American history, we have seen how the right to vote has been one of the most brutally contested rights in American history. It is important to put our current crisis, which I would describe as an ongoing assault on our democracy, in a larger historical context, which includes a recognition that we began this country really as a very much deformed, if you will, democracy, where voting was limited to not only just white men, but to white land-owning men. Women were excluded, of course, African Americans were excluded, any other person of color was excluded. And the kind of we the people has been an ongoing struggle to expand that we to include all American citizens. We know of the women's suffrage movements that helped fight and gain the right to vote for women. We later know the struggles of the civil rights struggle and the kind of flagship victory of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which not only enabled African Americans to vote, but put in place a enforcement system enforced by the Justice Department to ensure that there weren't barriers erected to make it more challenging for African Americans and other people of color to vote. Now, that history is important because we know that the vote is the way we express agency. And from a faith perspective, our vote is critical for how we protect the most vulnerable, how we protect the most marginalized. Now, fast forward in history and understand kind of the current context that we're in, the current struggle we're in, we have to go back to the year 2000, that highly contested election between between candidate Gore and candidate Bush, where ultimately Bush prevailed. And you remember all the controversies in Florida with hanging chads and a very narrow election. Well, a group of Republican operatives went down to Miami-Dade County and started to allege election fraud in that particular county. That was the beginning of an ongoing campaign that has only grown more sophisticated and more significant, where a faction within the Republican Party has had a very deliberate strategy of trying to suppress the votes of certain communities, particularly of the Black community, but also the Latino community, in some cases of young people, in order to maintain political power. They have recognized that the changing demographics in this country are not working in the favor of the Republican Party. Now, they could decide, and we're a nonpartisan organization like Interfaith, Power, and Light. They could decide, and I hope they would decide, that they would try to have a broader appeal to a larger electorate, that they would fight for the votes of African Americans and Latino Americans. But instead, they have chosen a strategy of subtraction rather than addition, where they are making it more difficult for certain communities to vote in order to blunt some of the impact of these changing demographics. Now, it's really important to emphasize that this strategy, again, kind of started in 2000, has been continuing ever since, and then got supercharged by a Supreme Court decision in 2013 entitled Shelby versus Holder, where the state of Alabama had a series of voting barriers in place, and Shelby County took the Justice Department all the way to the Supreme Court, basically arguing that the provisions in the Voting Rights Act, particularly the provision that ensured that any change in a southern state because of the history of voter suppression would have to then be approved and reviewed by the Justice Department, that provision got removed. They basically took the teeth out of, it's called the pre-clearance provision, got removed, stripped from the Voting Rights Act. And that then opened up the floodgates for many states in the South, but also in the Midwest, to start putting in place new barriers, often more sophisticated barriers that made it difficult for certain communities to vote. There is a playbook that has been put in place that even before the 2020 election, we saw many states starting to put in place these kind of barriers. They include everything from limiting early voting, which is very popular in communities of color, to moving polling sites, oftentimes, disproportionately impacting communities of color, enabling voting purges to take place, where literally, if people have not voted in 2 consecutive elections, they could be removed from the voting roll. Even if oftentimes, communities of color might move more often, they might not get the notice in the mail and lose their opportunity to vote as a result. Robocalls that are spreading misinformation, voter intimidation. There's a whole series of tactics that have been a part of this overall playbook. And in different combinations, they have been utilized in a number of states. Sojourners, in concert with the National African American Clergy Network, mounted a campaign called Lawyers and Callers in 2016 and 2018 to try to mobilize the faith community to protect the right to vote. Congressman John Lewis described the right to vote as sacred. He said that it is the most powerful, non-violent tool we have in our possession in a democracy. We believe that it's critical to frame the protecting the right to vote in the context of protecting Imago Dei itself. the core belief that unifies Christianity and Judaism and many Muslims, that we are made in the image and likeness of God, and that any effort to try to deny or make it more difficult for people to exercise that sacred right to vote is in essence an attack on Imago Dei itself. We know because of the 2020 election and the ways in which President Trump immediately politicized that election with the big lie that the election was stolen, a lie that he manufactured, a lie that he told even before the election results, where the election actually took place, and a lie that has only metastasized ever since. In part, I would argue, because of the cowardice of many Republicans who will admit privately that there was not widespread voter fraud, but are fearful of a big chunk of the Republican base that has believed this lie. And that lie has generated a great sense of grievance and anger that helped to foment and ultimately explode in the violent insurrection on January 6th. We are at a critical crossroads moment in our democracy. Dr. King's final book was entitled, "Where do we go from here? Chaos or Community?" And I think the question facing us today is, where do we go from here? Fascism or multiracial democracy? Now, you may think it's alarmist to describe the potential risk of our country moving down the path of fascism. But if you really look at the definition of fascism, it literally is about putting a party or a figure over the what's best for your nation. It is about oftentimes an allegiance to a particular race and maintaining that race's power rather than recognizing the strength of our multiracial pluralistic democracy. And so it's critical that we do everything in our power to try to ensure that people are registered to vote, that they are educated about the changes that have been made to voting in their states, and that we motivate them to vote so that we can, in this moment, protect our democracy. Just to put a little bit of this in sharper relief, according to the Brennan Center, which is a close partner of Sojourners, as of May 4th, there were 34 bills with restricted provisions that have been moving through 11 states. Since the beginning of 2021, 18 states have passed 34 restrictive voting laws, which disproportionately affect voters of color. And to make matters worse, in over 12 states, we see the passage of bills that make it easier for state legislators to overturn results. You might hear about this later from my colleague from Georgia, but it means in Georgia, if the state legislator doesn't like what happened in Fulton County, that they could overturn that election result and literally change the overall contours of the election itself. We are seeing more and more bills that make it easier to politicize election officials. And again, so much of our election system is very much in jeopardy and at risk. And so I just want to, close with this last argument. We have to be crystal clear that voter suppression is real and that it does pose a threat to our democracy. But we have to be equally crystal clear that voter fraud is largely a fabricated lie and myth that is being used to justify efforts to make it more difficult for people to vote. We also have to be crystal clear that this last election was not stolen. Supreme Court ultimately decided that. Courts across this land decided that. The Justice Department declared it a free and fair election. It is only President Trump and his allies that continue to use that lie to undermine our democracy and to try to retake power. But it is also true that because of so many of these laws that are being put in place, it will be easier for an election to truly be stolen in 2024. And that is why the work we're doing now is so critical. Not only do we need to protect the right to vote, we need to advocate to ensure that we can safeguard our political system. And certainly some of the changes that we were pushing through the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act and the Freedom to Vote Act, well, they got stymied by the filibuster and the lack of courage, I would argue, by Senator Sinema and Senator Manchin to pass those bills. We cannot give up on trying to push that agenda forward. And so I really hope that we can work together to ensure that not only are people motivated to vote, but they know how to vote, and that we can work together to ensure that the vote truly is free and fair in this next election, and in elections to come.
Thank you so much, Reverend Taylor. Thank you for that. We're going to take a few moments and do a Q&A with Reverend Taylor. So if you have any questions, please drop those into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. But I'll take some facilitator privilege here and get us started. So Adam, how do you see the connection between climate and environmental justice and voting rights?
You know, voting affects profoundly every single issue that we care about, and that includes environmental justice and climate. I think one of the reasons why we did not see kind of significant set of policy achievements around climate, and you know, I'm not trying to make any of these arguments as a partisan argument, but I think we have to face reality that by and large, the Republican Party has not been a strong advocate or friend of bold policies to address climate change. And because we had such a narrow Senate, you know, literally, Democrats controlling by one vote, that meant any defections could derail the efforts to try to put in place much stronger climate policies. And so in particular, the Build Back Better agenda had very strong provisions both around climate that ultimately have been derailed because of the resistance of Senator Manchin. And there has not been enough political will on the Republican side to find 10 votes that would enable us to overcome a filibuster. And so, you know, partly voting is critical, at least on that national agenda, to try to ensure that we can change those dynamics in Congress. It also is critical because how people vote really shapes and determines which issues are going to be at the top of the agenda. And how we continue to be engaged in our political system by trying to hold our elected officials accountable will also play a huge role in determining what happens around environmental justice and climate. And so, you know, I think at every level, it is critical to vote. And while I'm certainly grateful for the record turnout of voting in 2020, it breaks my heart and pains me that still a third of Americans, eligible American voters, did not vote. They decided to basically sit on the sidelines. At Sojourners, we really make the case that voting is, you know, a kind of a requirement of civic discipleship. That if we're serious about following Jesus, we got to be serious about using the tools at our disposal to ensure that we can protect the planet and protect those who are poor and those that are marginalized. And so, again, you know, voting is crucial.
Yeah, thanks so much. You know, the story you told about the 2000 election and kind of that as being the seed of modern voter fraud lies, I found really interesting, and thinking about how this really started 20 years ago. And so my question is, what if we flip that, and what is our vision? What is your vision for voting rights over the next 20 years? You know, building off of Reverend King's quote, where do we go from here? Where do we go from here over the next 20 years?
Yeah, no, well, I think there's a couple of pieces to that, and it's a great question. I mean, one, I think that we need to ensure that the 2022 election is a free and fair election, and that we really try to blunt some of the impacts of some of these new barriers that have been erected. You know, I try to be careful about making the complete comparison that they are exactly like the polling taxes and the literacy tests that were in place during Jim Crow. I mean, those were even more heinous and literally blocked the majority of African Americans from voting. But they are in the same vein, in the same spirit of those Jim Crow policies. And so I think it's really important that, you know, 2022, we mobilize a significant vote in order to send a message that, you know, the majority of the country want to protect our democracy. The majority of the country reject the big lie the last election was stolen, and understand that lie is corroding our democracy. It's corroding faith in our democracy. And so that's kind of one piece. Another piece is that, you know, we really need to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act so that we can restore the strength of the Voting Rights Act. And we need to pass some kind of bill. Doesn't have to be called the Freedom of Vote Act. It could be something different, but that does a number of things. It helps to protect the rights of felons or former felons all across the country. There's still over 10 states where you can serve your time, come out of prison, and still be denied the right to vote. We need to increase early voting days, which we know are really effective in increasing access to voting. We need to restore voting by mail and make that more of a consistent policy across the country. Certainly states can do it slightly differently, but access to vote by mail has been proven extremely effective and extremely secure in enabling people to vote. We need to restrict gerrymandering of districts. One of the things that is helping to drive our political system to the extremes is there's only 10% of the electorate that votes in our primaries, and 83% of congressional seats were determined by the primary in the last election. So no wonder there's these perverted incentives in place for candidates to try to appeal to the most extreme side of their party. And I think that's particularly happening on the Republican side, but it also can happen on the Democratic side. And then, I think it's really critical to make Election Day a national holiday, to make it possible, particularly for working class people to vote. So there's just a handful of things like that that to me are just common sense and should not be a partisan issue. It is an absolute tragedy that, again, because of President Trump and the big lie, voting rights has somehow become this partisan issue. It should be an American democracy issue. It should be a faith issue, not a partisan issue. And we've really got to find kind of more partners, particularly on the Republican side, that are willing to speak out and to kind of make that case.
Amen. Amen. Well, thank you, Reverend Taylor. Thank you for being with us tonight. Thanks for your words and for your vision. And really appreciate it.
If I could just say one last thing, which
Yes.
is one of the initiatives that I mentioned just briefly earlier has kind of, we changed the name in part because we felt like we had to go even bigger after 2020 to protect the right to vote. So we have a campaign that is called Face United to Save Democracy that you can learn more about at turnoutsunday.com. And we are working in 10 battleground states, including the ones you're going to feature later, Texas and Georgia and others, where we are mobilizing rabbis, imams, and pastors to use their moral authority to protect the right to vote. We're engaging in voter registration, voter mobilization, and voter protection efforts. We're literally right now meeting with secretaries of state and election officials in all of these states for kind of accountability meetings. So we'd love to find ways to partner. We'd love to involve any of the clergy, rabbis, and others that are on this call.
Great. Thank you, Reverend Taylor. That's turnoutsunday.com. Right, .com. Great. And Mike put that into the chat. Well, thank you. Please, everyone, join me in gratitude and thank you for Reverend Taylor.
Thank you.
At this point, we're going to transition to the next section of our agenda. And to facilitate that, I will pass it over to Madison Mayhew, who is the Federal Policy Associate for Interfaith Power and Light. Madison, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Avery, for that introduction, and thank you all for joining us. As Avery said, my name is Madison Mayhew. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a federal policy advocate with the National IPL team. I'm going to spend a couple of minutes giving some context for the state of play at the federal level to help us frame why getting involved at the state level is so important. And then I will pass it to my colleagues who lead IPL state affiliates to highlight the context of their own state and how people of faith are engaging there. We're gathered here today because we believe that every voice matters in creating and sustaining our democracy, and because a healthy democracy is imperative to maintaining a healthy climate and promoting environmental justice. We know the fight for equal and equitable voting rights protections is certainly not new. As Reverend Taylor reminded us of the long struggle in our country's history, including the Supreme Court repeal of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which prohibited discriminatory voting practices, and its repealment has led to voter suppression, particularly in communities of color. It's been said already, but I think it's worthwhile to repeat again. We've seen numerous state legislators put up roadblocks to voting, including purging registered voters from voter rolls without notifying them, closing hundreds of polling places in communities of color, restricting voter registration time periods, and requiring voters to show forms of ID that many people don't have. Earlier this year, there was an effort by Congress to pass comprehensive voting rights legislation to address these attacks through the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act, which Reverend Taylor also alluded to. The John Lewis bill would have restored these protections while expanding opportunities to vote, responding to voter suppression tactics, addressing gerrymandering, and reforming campaign finance. Due to the filibuster, which requires 60 votes for legislation to pass, this bill was not successful. Research has shown that the filibuster has a legacy of promoting white supremacy by blocking important civil rights legislation, including imperative voting rights protections for all Americans. Our democracy is more important than the filibuster. There have been additional attempts and ongoing efforts to continue to address some of the underlying issues threatening our democracy through reforming the Electoral Count Act, which defines the counting of electoral votes following a presidential election, and the Disclose Act, which would ultimately address dark money and campaign finance. Ever since the 2010 Supreme Court decision in Citizens United, wealthy donors tied to super PACs have continued to influence elections through the spread of dark money into shadowy nonprofits who don't disclose their donors. Voters deserve to know how money influences their elections, and the Disclose Act would tell us which billionaires and corporations are using dark money to unfairly influence our politics. Because we don't have the protections at the federal level to ensure safe and fair elections, we have an important role to play at the state and local level to protect our democracy. We may have a big hill to climb ahead of us, and it may feel daunting and uncertain, but I'm fully confident that we will succeed by working together. I'll end with a quote I find myself returning to throughout my work these days from Václav Havel, the former president of the Czech Republic, who wrote, "Hope in a deep and powerful sense is not the same as joy that things are going well or willingness to invest in enterprises that are obviously headed for early success, but rather an ability to work for something because it is good, not just because it stands a chance to succeed. The more unpromising the situation in which we demonstrate hope, the deeper that hope is. Hope is not the same thing as optimism. It is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense regardless of how it turns out." As people of faith who believe in uplifting the dignity and worth of all people, we have a responsibility to protect the rights of voters to have their voices heard in our communities. And now I'll pass it on to Gayla from Georgia IPL to highlight the work that they are doing there.
Hello, my name is Gayla Tillman, and I am the Policy Associate here at Georgia Interfaith Power and Light. And I just want to echo what everyone has been saying in terms of like our democracy is worth fighting for. I could actually, being in Georgia, I feel like I could run down a laundry list of things that are going wrong in our state, unfortunately. However, the people of Georgia have shown time and time again that given the opportunity, the people of Georgia will show up and show out. And that's what I care about the most. So in the state of Georgia, unfortunately, some of our election workers get threatened. Unfortunately, our legislature has a lot to say in terms of what happens in terms of like the actual results of an election. The January 6th hearings highlighted some of the election workers that were facing death threats and all kinds of like harm during the past election cycle. And what I really want folks to understand is that while there are so many barriers to Georgia, there are Georgians that are showing up at the ballot box because there are interesting races. Like, I want us to understand that as faith, climate justice voters, that doesn't mean, oh, we vote for the presidency or we vote for the senator. It means that we vote up and down the ballot. And because here in the state of Georgia, like, we've got our attorney general races that are heating up, our lieutenant governor races, like there's quite a few contentious races on the ballot. And of course, nonpartisanly, I can't say like who I support or who y'all should support. I just know that interest in down ballot racing in down ballot races is really significant because it shows that not only are we paying attention to the reconciliation package, it's also showing that we're paying attention to what's happening on a daily basis. Just like here in Georgia, we care very deeply about energy policy. So we are always talking about our public service commission races. In your state, it may be called public utility commission. But public service commission races, attorney general, like, the state of Georgia is facing barrier after barrier, and us as advocates, we are making sure that people know that it is worth fighting for. The fact that you have really high utility bills, that is worth going to the ballot box for. The fact that you spend an absurd amount of money on gas is worth going to the ballot for. So I think what's really important about this time is for us to have, this is pun intended, have faith in our people, have faith in knowing that there are so many barriers and there are so many things going on. But when we lean into each other, when we say, you know what, this is hard, I'm going to join arm in arm, whether metaphorically or literally, I'm going to be arm in arm with people who go to the ballot box with me, and I'm going to vote my values. I am going to make a statement and say, I care very deeply about our climate. I care very deeply that the children, the generations after me are able to have a future that is livable, that is sustainable, and where we all thrive. And I think there's a lot of ways that division kind of like sneaks its way into our movement, until, you know, what we do. And I think it's our job to push back and say, you know what, at the end of the day, as long as you are voting your values, and as long as you are arm in arm with me, fighting for something that is just, fighting for something that is morally ethical for like all of us, and significantly better than what we are currently experiencing, I think that's really what energizes me. So yeah, just again, some of those barriers are language access. Oh, and the last thing that I'll mention is language access, last but not least, because a lot of the communities we work with here in the state of Georgia, English is not their first language. That's just the growing immigrant population in Georgia, and that is a beautiful thing. And so what I think is beautiful is making voting more accessible for those people. So whether that be, you know, language access, whether that be getting away from all these voter ID laws that require 50 bazillion types of ID, like making sure that the people of Georgia who have been here, that have invested here, have an opportunity to participate in our democracy. I think it's really significant. And so again, there's a laundry list of problems in Georgia. However, the great state of Georgia reminds me every day that there are people that will fight for our democracy and that will fight for our values. And that's what really keeps me up, and that gets me up in the morning. So I'm going to pass it to my friend Dennis to talk more about what's going on in other states.
Hey, thanks, Gail, for letting us know what's going on in Georgia. And so I'm here to talk about voter suppression and what that looks like in the modern day today. It can take on a lot of obscure ways that we can't necessarily see. But then again, as a student of history, you know, it's a modern day poll tax, in a sense that those that are in poverty, those that are financially struggling, it becomes increasingly hard to either make it to the polls, right? And let's go a little bit further in terms of how the climate impacts it. We're in Michigan, right? At certain times of the year, it can get colder in Michigan than places in the Arctic. You know, that's at least you know what some of the local news likes to say in the morning, and it can get incredibly cold. It becomes getting incredibly cold right around December. And, you know, normal winter stuff, but we have Arctic snaps and all types of new language that has really only become new in the last decade. And so knowing how long lines can be in Detroit for waiting at the polls, a lot of people vote in person still. And I think this can be echoed across the states, that there's a after work surge right around 6 to 7 p.m. And depending on what your traffic looks like and just the dynamic of the daily events, you can very well end up at the polls at 8 o'clock, past 8 o'clock. Some people, and so we can talk about intimidation and the discrimination through lack of competency through training. Where some poll workers who are being paid through the city clerk's office are turning people away who are already in line at 8 p.m. And I'll speak personally just for Michigan, where that's if you're in line, that's your timestamp at 8 p.m. That there's a timestamp that needs to be conducted by poll workers or maybe the polling captain, where if you're in line at 8 p.m., you can still vote, right? And so just let's take a small pause in it and go back just to the history and the origination of the poll tax, and it begins coming out of once we get to the place where the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment were ratified, that not just allowed for the freedom of our ancestors and for our ancestors, that it also allowed for for the our ability to vote, and for uh, it allowed for our ability to vote, and also it allowed for different ways for them to legally legally impair our ability to vote. And so you have the first Black governor in Louisiana. His name is PBS Pinchback, and uh, after a slew of high level Black elected officials, your very first Black elected officials began right after the Civil War during the 1870s, the 80s, the 1890s. And that's when the crackdown and the mainstream introduction of poll taxes was sort of mainstayed across the country. And so those have sort of ebbed and flowed over time. And so in 2020, just speaking from just speaking from Detroit, sometimes polling locations can be over a mile away, right? Where our city's designed for cars and not public transit, right? Which again is all impacted through climate justice because of emissions. You have the local concentration of these emissions, and everything that comes in, all the indirect disparate impacts that comes into play when you don't have public transit readily accessible in large metropolises. Um, and so understand I gotta wrap things up soon. That yeah, so like the distance being an issue, lack of public transportation, these all act as indirect poll taxes that deter away from higher voter turnout. This is why in some state primaries, the city has places where there's single digit turnout. That's without a doubt not just on a lack of communication and education around civic engagement by between public school systems, the city clerks, county clerk's office. Um, it's a systemic issue. And so just moving along, in that once they do get to the polls, they can run into eligibility issues where they can either, in Michigan, you're allowed to sign an affidavit that says that you pledge to the, you swear an oath, punishable by the court of Michigan, that you are who you say you are, you live where you say you reside, and you can still vote without an ID. There's still plenty of people that's turned away while they'll show up to vote, they'll overcome all these other obstacles, they'll overcome the poll tax. And just again, like this poll tax back in 1870, it's a $20 or $19 equivalent for what it costs to go to the polls. If you want to catch a lift to the polls, that's going to cost you about $15-20, depending upon if you're at peak hour, right, or peak rush. And so it's wild that the cost in today's dollars in 1890 was $19 to literally vote, but now the indirect cost of going to vote is still right around $19, right? And of course, you might be able, you can walk that mile. Maybe a able-bodied person can walk that mile, but then there's the issue of disability justice, and even the civil rights and how that impacts older generations that aren't ably bodied and able to walk the mile that it can typically take. Not to mention that you will pass one or two other polling locations in oddly gerrymandered precincts. You'll pass one or two polling locations just to get to a farther polling location, and that's the type of inefficiencies that I at least see across the state of Michigan. And so I think, just wrapping up in terms of what we can do, is challenge our local clerk's office. This is the smallest branch towards the ground that we can sort of rattle and sort of manipulate in terms of our favor. That our local clerk's office is the first step where we have the power to sort of make sure that our election systems are transparent and have integrity maintained. So just wrapping that up, I'll figure out how to do Q&A in a moment, if there is Q&A, and I'd like to pass it to my partner. Let's see, open that up. But yeah, pass that along.
Hi,
B.
y'all. My name's B. Moorhead. I'm the director of Texas Impact, and I will keep this a very brief. I know you'll want to keep moving, but I want to focus a little bit on solutions. I'll start by saying Texas was referred to on NPR this morning as ground zero for everything bad that's going on in the country. So that's awesome for us in Texas. It is, in fact, ground zero in a lot of ways for voter suppression. We passed legislation last year called SB 1. It sets up unique barriers to voting and is particularly pernicious in our view because it targets election workers. So it's not intended just to disenfranchise individual people. It's intended to undermine, or if it's not intended, then someone did a really bad job, because the outcome of the bill is to undermine our entire system of elections, which in Texas, as is the case in other states, depends on huge numbers of volunteer election workers throughout the state doing their jobs routinely without fear of reprisal. Because the Senate Bill 1 was so bad, Texas Impact took the unusual step for the first time in our 50-year history of suing the state of Texas. And Adam mentioned the Brennan Center. Brennan Center is representing us in that lawsuit. We also had an individual member of Texas Impact who's a volunteer deputy registrar, who brought a separate suit also represented by the Brennan Center. That suit actually was decided in her favor, but in a way that hasn't helped as much as we hoped it would. We also had a Latina staff member in the last election cycle who was purged. Her voter registration was purged out of the system. So we've had some personal experience. For all those reasons, we are very focused at this point on congregations as election mobilizers. We see congregations of all faiths as anchors in local communities. They often have a high voting propensity of their own. They are in great position to lead the rest of the community in increasing voter turnout. I'm going to put a link in the chat. We have, I'm attempting to put a link in the chat there. We have a resource that is, I think it's very Texas-y, but would easily be untexified. It's a toolkit for congregations that want to do election mobilization in their immediate local vicinity. We also have congregations throughout the state in judicatories and denominations that want to have regional influence. The North Texas Conference of the United Methodist Church recently passed a resolution calling on all of their congregations to be involved in the election. For that reason, we've gone ahead and subscribed to Ballot Ready, which is a service that will provide some tools for congregations to track their engagement in getting out the vote. And finally, I'll just say we've partnered with some interesting partners that I wouldn't have expected, including most recently Match.com. Their corporate headquarters are in Dallas, and they've asked us to provide some volunteer opportunities for their staff in Dallas, working with faith communities to help mobilize the vote in that area of the state. So I'm also happy to answer questions, but I think focusing on congregations as bodies that can mobilize the wider community for elections is going to be a more and more important thing, and we're happy to work with other folks too. Thanks.
Great, thank you, B, and thanks to our full panel. I'll invite you all to come back on camera here, and we'll have a short panel discussion with. We'll take up one question here together, and this is coming in from Sherwood. Sherwood sent this in earlier. And the question is, how do we mobilize church congregations or other congregations of other faiths around the country to become involved? In particular, how do we get church leadership to take a public stand? And I think maybe one spin to this that I think would be interesting to folks is for church leaders who maybe see this as too political or see talking about voting rights as weighing into politics, how do we convince those leaders that they need to be talking about this? Yeah, B, let's start with you.
So we've had that question coming up kind of more and more. People who haven't historically been involved see the need. What we typically use is a publication from the IRS from 2004, Politics and the Pulpit, and it has a series of very plain language explanations that we've used often to help people. This is not the same thing as partisan political activity.
Thanks, B. Gayla?
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate this question because it's a question I have to ask myself too. I think what's important for us to remember is that regardless of faith, houses of worship are where people seek refuge, whether that be some folks are like looking for assistance with their rent or with their utilities, or, you know, that's where people go like, hey, I'm struggling with my family. Like, could you pray for them? Like, or, you know, my family member is out sick. Could you pray for them? And so like, I think about these things because climate directly interacts with so many things. So for example, someone could be, you know, sick because they have asthma, like, you know, asking for healing and things like that is directly related to some of these environmental impacts that we're seeing in our natural environment. And so I think it's important for us to think, about the intersections of climate and health and how that just interacts with everything. But also just seeing how like people look to faith leaders as a North Star, as a guide. And so if people are looking to you for that, you're talking about ethics. If you're just like, okay, you should be involved in this, whether that be voting, census, all the civic engagement things, like you're doing these things because you want a better world for yourself, for your family. You want to look down at your son or your daughter or your child and they not be struggling with asthma. You want to look at your, you know, elder in your family and they're not struggling to breathe, or, you know, making sure they're not, you know, struggling with extreme heat. Like, these things are everywhere. These climate impacts are everywhere. And it doesn't have to be this super partisan, like, what do you think about plastic? It could just be, I want a community where everyone can breathe healthy air. That is something that is like bare bones, like ethics. So I think the best ways that we can get people involved is reminding them that we do this work because it is a moral responsibility. It's not because like, you know, we just have to get all the votes and we have to do this thing. We do this because we have a deep care for the people in our communities and for our common home.
Amen. Amen. Thank you, Gayla. We're going to move on, but I invite all of the panelists. There are some great questions in the Q&A function. If you have access to those, well, you could just tell me, are you all able to see those and respond to them? So if you want to respond to those in the Q&A function, take up a couple there that you think are relevant to you and respond to them. I think that would be really helpful for anyone who sent in questions. But thank you all. Please, everyone join me in celebrating and giving a round of applause, using the reactions, if you will, for all of our panelists here this evening. So now we're going to shift into a call to action. And I've seen several questions come in about, okay, what do we do? What can I do in my community? What can I do as an individual to change this? And so we'll share some opportunities for you here now. We know that voting is how we create a society based on our shared values. We've heard that from all of our speakers today. And that this upcoming election is about the values that are shaping our future. It's about our communities, just like Ayla was saying. And as people of faith and people of conscience, our values call us to care for our neighbors and to care for our sacred earth. So we can join together to vote our values and to make a difference. So what we're sharing with you tonight is that we want to encourage you to protect democracy by making sure your community is ready to vote. And tonight, and for the next several months, Interfaith Power and Light is partnering with When We All Vote which is a national nonpartisan initiative of Civic Nation to make sure people are ready to vote, to make sure your communities are ready to vote. At our When We All Vote provided website, which will soon drop in the chat for you to see, people can register to vote or simply visit there to verify their registration is up to date, which is something important to do every year for anyone in light of voter suppression. Make sure your registration still stands. And because we showed up as voters of faith and conscience in 2020, many states across the country have passed laws to put up new barriers to voting that especially impact Black, Brown, young voters, and voters with disabilities. So using this registration tool, you can simply encourage people to register to vote or verify their registration online. And through their Faith Climate Justice voter campaign, Interfaith Power and Light has set a goal to register at least 1,000 voters. And if everyone signed up for this webinar, committed to register just 3 new voters, we would easily reach that goal. So please visit that website, check your registration, and share it with your faith communities. We also want to share that we're here to make sure your community as a whole is ready to vote. So we want to invite you to join us on July 25th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, 12 p.m. Pacific Time for a brief online voter registration training. This is going to be an important gathering where Interfaith Power and Light is providing the resources, the structure, and the guidance needed to register voters. We'll provide strategies and other ways to help register voters both virtually and in your community and to make a meaningful impact. So you can visit that registration at the link in the chat. I know that that was a lot, that there are a few opportunities there. You can find them in the chat, but also don't fret if you didn't catch it all. Tomorrow, we'll send out a follow-up email with all of the links that I just reviewed, and we'll also include some other ways you can quickly and simply turn out the Faith Climate Justice vote in your community. We'll also, in that follow-up, provide the recording of our session here tonight. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for tuning in today, for being part of this important conversation, for taking time to listen to the stories of climate justice voting and to commit yourself and your community to being faith climate justice voters. If you have other questions that we've not yet covered, you can follow up by sending those to info@interfaithpowerandlight.org, and we'll drop that in the chat here. I want to take another moment and thank all of our guests here today, and please join me with the reactions. I want to thank Reverend Adam Taylor, Madison Mayhew, Gayla Tillman, Dennis Black, and B. Moorhead. Thank you all for your work. Thank you for your witness. And again, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Blessings on the journey. Bye.